By the early summer of 1940, the war in Europe appeared to be entering its final stage. In less than a year, Germany had defeated Poland, overwhelmed Norway and Denmark, swept through the Low Countries, and crushed France in just 6 weeks. The speed of these victories shocked the world. What had once seemed impossible now appeared inevitable. The British Army escaped destruction at Dunkirk, but the evacuation came at a cost. Nearly all heavy equipment was abandoned. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, supplies left behind on the beaches of northern France. Britain had saved its soldiers, but it had lost the means to fight a continental war. Across Europe, governments collapsed or capitulated. Germany now dominated the continent from the Arctic Circle to the Bay of Biscay. Britain stood alone. This moment mattered because it shaped how both sides understood what would come next. Germany believed the war in the West was essentially over. Britain believed it had reached a point of no return. What followed would be decided not on land, but in the air. From Berlin's perspective, Britain's position appeared increasingly hopeless. Its closest ally on the continent had been defeated. Its army was weakened. Its cities were exposed. The Royal Navy remained powerful, but Germany believed air power could neutralize that advantage. If Britain could be pressured hard enough, it would choose negotiation over destruction. This belief was not irrational. Throughout history, nations in similar positions had often sought terms. Germany expected Britain to do the same. Adolf Hitler himself still hoped Britain might withdraw from the war rather than face prolonged conflict. He did not see Britain as a natural enemy in the same way he viewed France or the Soviet Union. In July 1940, he made what he described as a final appeal for peace. Britain rejected it. This rejection forced Germany to confront a problem it had not fully prepared for: how to defeat a nation that refused to surrender, even when strategically isolated. Germany's answer was air power. The Luftwaffe entered the Battle of Britain with enormous confidence. In Poland and France, German air power played a decisive role. Enemy air forces were destroyed on the ground. Communications were disrupted. Armies were thrown into confusion. The Luftwaffe worked closely with advancing ground forces to break resistance quickly. But this success came with limitations. The Luftwaffe had been designed to support fast-moving land campaigns, not to conduct a prolonged, independent air war against the defended homeland. It lacked a long-range strategic bombing doctrine and had little experience fighting an enemy air force that could retreat, repair, and return to combat. Despite this, German leadership believed the RAF could be destroyed within weeks. There was no single, clearly defined plan for how this would be achieved, only an assumption that Britain's defenses would collapse under sustained pressure. This assumption would shape every decision that followed. One of the central problems Germany faced in 1940 was not technological or numerical, it was conceptual. Germany did not expect Britain to continue the war alone. The air campaign that followed was never fully conceived as a decisive battle for control of the skies. Instead, it was treated as a tool to force Britain into submission. Pressure would be applied, losses would mount, Britain would eventually break. This mindset led to critical misunderstandings. German leadership measured success primarily in terms of aircraft destroyed. Britain measured success in terms of whether its air defense system could still function the next day. These were not the same. As long as Britain could still detect incoming raids, scramble fighters, and prevent air superiority, it could continue fighting, regardless of how many aircraft were lost. Germany did not fully appreciate this distinction. Britain had no illusions about its situation. The government understood that defeat in the air would certainly mean invasion. If the RAF were destroyed, the Royal Navy alone could not stop Germany from crossing the Channel indefinitely. This knowledge shaped Britain's approach. Rather than seeking dramatic victories, Britain focused on endurance. The goal was not to destroy the Luftwaffe outright, but to deny it control of the skies for long enough to make evasion impossible. This was a defensive strategy, but not a passive one. Britain invested heavily in coordination, communication, and efficiency. Every sortie, every pilot, and every aircraft mattered. At the height of the fighting, Winston Churchill summarized the stakes in words that were not meant for inspiration, but for clarity. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Britain understood exactly what was coming. By July 1940, the conditions for the Battle of Britain were set. Germany believed it could force Britain out of the war through air power. Britain believed survival depended on preventing that outcome at all costs. Both sides entered the battle with confidence and with blind spots. The next phase of the battle would reveal those blind spots. It would expose what Germany had misunderstood about Britain's defenses and what Britain had quietly built to survive. The story begins with how Britain saw the enemy coming and how Germany failed to see Britain clearly at all. When the Battle of Britain began in earnest in July 1940, it did not resemble the kind of air war Germany had fought before. There were no advancing armies to support, no collapsing front lines to exploit. Britain was not trying to break through German defenses or seize territory, it was trying to survive. This meant the battle was shaped less by dramatic encounters and more by systems, how information moved, how decisions were made, and how resources were managed under pressure. Germany believed it could win the battle by destroying enough aircraft and airfields. Britain believed it could win by remaining operational. That difference defined everything that followed. One of the most important advantages Britain possessed in 1940 was not a weapon, but awareness. Long before German bombers reached British airspace, they were often already being tracked. This early warning allowed Britain to avoid wasting pilots and fuel on constant patrols and instead respond precisely, only when needed. This capability rested on a network that Germany never fully understood. Britain's coastal radar stations detected incoming aircraft at long range. That information was passed to filtering centers, where false readings were removed and confirmed raids were identified. From there, reports went to Fighter Command's operations rooms, where controllers decided how and when to respond. This process happened continuously, often under intense pressure. It meant British pilots were rarely sent into the air blindly. They were guided toward incoming raids, informed of enemy strength, and recalled once their role was complete. Germany had radar of its own. What it lacked was this level of integration. German intelligence did know radar existed. What it failed to grasp was how central it was to Britain's entire air defense system. German attacks occasionally struck radar stations, but they were never treated as priority targets. Damage was often repaired quickly, and the system remained functional even when individual stations were temporarily knocked out. German planners continued to believe that Britain's defenses were brittle, that once enough aircraft were destroyed, resistance would collapse. This belief was reinforced by inflated victory claims and poor intelligence. German leadership repeatedly overestimated RAF losses while underestimating British repair and replacement rates. Aircraft written off in combat were sometimes back in service within days. Pilots rotated out of exhaustion squadrons returned after rest. The battle Germany thought it was fighting did not match the battle Britain was actually fighting. Geography also quietly favored Britain. German aircraft operated from bases in occupied Europe. Every mission required crossing the English Channel, which limited fuel reserves and reduced combat time. If a German aircraft was damaged, the chances of returning were slim. British pilots, however, fought over their own territory. If they were shot down, many survived. Some landed in fields, some parachuted into towns, some crash landed on friendly airfields. Pilots who lived could often fly again within days. Aircraft could be repaired quickly, ground crews worked around the clock. This meant Britain was not simply replacing losses, it was recycling experience. Germany had no equivalent advantage. Pilots lost over Britain were captured, pilots lost at sea were gone, experience drained away slowly but steadily. On paper, the exchange rates appeared manageable. In reality, the Luftwaffe was bleeding irreplaceable skill. As July turned into August, German attacks intensified. The Luftwaffe targeted airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The pressure on fighter command increased daily. Squadrons flew multiple sorties a day. Fatigue became constant. Losses mounted. From the German perspective, progress seemed real. Airfields were damaged, aircrafts were destroyed on the ground, RAF squadrons appeared to be shrinking. Intelligence reports suggested Britain was nearing collapse. But the system continued to function. Radar still detected raids, command centers still coordinated responses, pilots still took off, fought, landed, and returned. The German strategy relied on attrition, but attrition only works if the enemy cannot recover. Britain could recover. These differences in perspective proved decisive. Germany counted aircraft destroyed, Britain counted days survived. As long as fighter command remained operational, Britain remained unconquered. Air superiority, not casualty figures, was the true objective. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding understood this better than anyone. He resisted calls for reckless engagements and conserved his forces whenever possible. Reflecting on the battle later, Dowding summarized Britain's position with clarity. We were not trying to win spectacular victories. We were trying not to lose. This mindset shaped Britain's response throughout the battle. By late August, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority despite weeks of sustained effort. Britain was under strain, but it had not broken. Germany faced a growing dilemma. Continuing to attack RAF infrastructure risked further losses without guaranteed success. Shifting strategies might produce psychological effects, but it also meant abandoning the one approach that had brought Germany closest to victory. At this moment, Germany still had options. What it chose next would decide the outcome of the battle. In early September 1940, Germany did change its bombing priorities. Rather than focusing on Britain's air defense system, the Luftwaffe turned its attention towards cities. London became the primary target. Civilian areas were bombed in increasing numbers. The Blitz had begun. Germany believed this shift would break British morale and force a decision. Instead, it gave Britain something it desperately needed: time. Why that decision proved fatal to Germany's campaign, and how September 15th exposed the limits of German air power, is where the Battle of Britain truly turned. By the beginning of September 1940, the Battle of Britain had reached its most critical stage. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had concentrated on RAF airfields, sector stations, and aircraft factories across southern England. Fighter command was under relentless pressure. Squadrons were exhausted, aircraft losses mounted, some airfields were damaged repeatedly, forcing operations to shift elsewhere. For the first time, Britain's air defense system was close to its limits. But from the German perspective, the situation looked different. German intelligence reports already suggested the RAF was near collapse. Aircraft destruction claims were high, British fighter resistance appeared sporadic, Luftwaffe commanders believed that fighter command had been effectively beaten. This belief, incorrect but widely accepted, shaped what happened next. Rather than continuing to press attacks against RAF infrastructure, German leadership chose to change strategy. In early September 1940, German bombing priorities shifted away from airfields and towards British cities. London became the primary target. Large-scale raids were launched against civilian areas, docks, and industrial districts. The reasons for this shift were complex. Part of it was retaliation for British raids on Berlin, part of it was political, intending to break civilian morale, and part of it stemmed from the mistaken belief that the RAF no longer posed a threat. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was immediate. By easing pressure on RAF airfields and command centers, Germany gave Fighter Command exactly what it needed most: time. Ground crews repaired runways, aircraft were dispersed and camouflaged, pilots were rested and rotated, command systems stabilized. Britain's air defense network, which had been close to breaking point, regained balance. The bombing of British cities became known as the Blitz. Night after night, German bombers struck London and other major urban centers. Fires burned across neighborhoods, thousands were killed or wounded, millions were displaced or forced into shelters. From a human perspective, the cost was immense. But from a military perspective, the Blitz failed to achieve its primary objective. Britain did not collapse. Production continued. Fighter Command remained operational. Morale, while strained, did not break in the way German planners had hoped. Germany had assumed that sustained bombing of civilian populations would force Britain to seek peace. Instead, it hardened resistance and unified public opinion behind continued defiance. More importantly, it failed to eliminate Britain's ability to fight in the air. Despite the shift toward bombing cities, the Luftwaffe did not immediately abandon daylight operations. On 15 September 1940, Germany launched a series of large-scale daylight raids against London. The attacks were intended to test whether the RAF could still respond in strength and to deliver a decisive blow if they could not. British radar detected the incoming formations early. Fighter Command responded by committing squadrons in carefully timed waves, rather than exhausting pilots through constant engagement. Interceptions were coordinated and concentrated where they mattered most. Throughout the day, intense air battles unfolded over southern England and the skies above London. By evening, German losses were heavy. While Germany could still mount large raids, it became clear that air superiority over Britain was not achievable at an acceptable cost. For Britain, September 15th marked the moment when survival turned into confidence. By late September, the nature of the battle had changed. Germany could continue bombing Britain, particularly at night, but it could not destroy Fighter Command. It could not neutralize Britain's air defense system, and without control of the skies, invasion was impossible. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was postponed indefinitely. At the heart of Germany's failure was attrition. Aircraft could be replaced, pilots could not. German losses increasingly fell on experienced aircrews, whose training took months or years to replace. Pilots shot down over Britain were captured. Pilots lost at sea were gone forever. Britain, by contrast, retained many of its experienced pilots. Training programs continued, aircraft production increased, the balance shifted slowly but decisively. Germany had entered the battle assuming time was on its side. By autumn, it was clear that time favored Britain. Within the German leadership, confidence began to erode. Losses mounted without corresponding gains. Air superiority remained elusive. Britain showed no sign of negotiating. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its primary objective, and without air superiority, the invasion of Britain was no longer realistic. Reflecting later on the campaign, one senior German commander acknowledged this shift bluntly. We had underestimated the strength of British resistance in the air. The Battle of Britain was effectively decided. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe reduced daylight operations over Britain. Night bombing continued, but the decisive phase of the battle had passed. Britain had survived. Germany had failed to force a decision in the West. The consequences of that failure would extend far beyond the skies over southern England. The final part of this story is not about how the battle ended, but about what its outcome changed and why it mattered. There was no formal declaration marking the end of the battle, no single moment of victory or defeat. Instead, the fighting gradually diminished as German priorities shifted elsewhere. But the outcome was clear. Germany had attempted to force Britain out of the war through air power and failed. While the RAF remained operational, the human cost of the battle, particularly during the Blitz, was severe. German bombing raids caused widespread destruction across British cities. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and many other urban centers were repeatedly hit. Thousands of civilians were killed. Tens of thousands were injured. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Millions of people spent nights in shelters, basements, and underground stations. Daily life continued under the constant expectation of air raids. For many, exhaustion became a permanent condition. Yet despite this pressure, Britain did not break. Civil defense systems adapted. Emergency services improved their response. Communities reorganized themselves around survival. While morale fluctuated, there was no mass collapse or political demand for surrender. Germany had assumed that civilian bombing would force a decision. Instead, it reinforced Britain's determination to continue. The failure to defeat Britain in the air had immediate military consequences. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain, depended entirely on air superiority. Without control of the skies, German transport ships would have been vulnerable to the Royal Navy and RAF attack. The invasion was postponed repeatedly and eventually abandoned. This decision marked a turning point. For the first time since the war began, Germany had been stopped. Its momentum in the West had ended. Britain remained in the war as a base, a symbol, and a future launching point for Allied operations. The channel, which Germany had hoped to cross, became a barrier it could not overcome. The failure of the Battle of Britain forced Germany to make new choices. With Britain still in the war, Germany now faced the prospect of a prolonged conflict. Rather than continuing to focus westward, German leadership increasingly turned its attention east. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This decision opened a second front that would ultimately prove decisive. Had Britain fallen in 1940, the war might have followed a very different path. There would have been no secure base for Allied bombing campaigns, no staging ground for a return to Western Europe, and no guarantee that the United States could later intervene effectively. Britain's survival altered the structure of the war itself. Germany did not lose the Battle of Britain because of inferior aircraft or lack of courage. It lost because it misunderstood the nature of the battle it was fighting. Germany expected a short campaign against a weakened enemy. Instead, it faced a system designed for defense, recovery, and endurance. It measured success by destruction rather than control. It underestimated Britain's ability to absorb losses and continue fighting. Most critically, Germany changed strategy at the moment sustained pressure mattered the most. By shifting from RAF infrastructure to civilian targets, it relieved pressure on fighter command and allowed Britain's defenses to stabilize. What Germany intended as escalation became a strategic mistake. The Luftwaffe had entered the battle confident that air power alone could decide the outcome. The Battle of Britain proved that air power, without clear objectives and accurate intelligence, had limits. The Battle of Britain has often been remembered through simplified narratives, heroic pilots, dramatic dogfights, and moments of national defiance. While these elements mattered, they obscure the deeper lesson. The battle was not won by a single day, a single decision, or a single group of individuals. It was won through coordination, restraint, and the ability to endure pressure over time. Britain did not need to destroy the Luftwaffe, it only needed to survive. Looking back, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding reflected on the battle's significance in understated terms. If we had been defeated, everything else would have followed. This statement captured the reality of the moment. The Battle of Britain was the first major defeat suffered by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. It demonstrated that Germany was not invincible. It preserved Britain as a fighting power, and it ensured that the war would continue, not just in Europe, but across the world. Germany lost the Battle of Britain not because it lacked strength, but because it failed to understand what kind of war it was fighting. In the skies over southern England, limits were exposed. Limits of planning, intelligence, and assumption.